Welcome to the Widowed Parent Podcast with your host, Jenny Lisk.
Hey everyone, it's Jenny Lisk, and this is episode 155 of the Widowed Parent Podcast. So I had such a great discussion with Jeanette Koncikowski for this episode. And we first talked about 5 years ago when Jeanette was my guest way back in episode 10. And I invited her back now because she is out with a brand new book called Shipwrecked, a memoir of widowed parenting and life after loss. And it is a teaching memoir in which Jeanette both shares her family's journey and explores themes and issues and questions that are common to newly widowed parents. And somewhat like our last episode, this is a story where my guest had a complicated situation when their spouse died. Jeanette and her husband Mark had been separated for over a year at that point, and when he died, they were actually dating again, and they were in couples counseling. And one of the reasons Jeanette wrote this book and speaks at Camp Widow and other places is that she wants people to understand that not everyone had a perfect marriage when they were widowed. Plus, Jeanette gives us a gift towards the end of the book when she interviews her now teenage children about their experiences losing their dad and reflecting on the decades since his death. Before we jump into my discussion with Jeanette, I wanted to let you guys know some news from here. So first of all, we are coming up on the 1-year anniversary of my second book, Widowed Parents Unite, 52 Tips to Get Through the First Year from One Widowed Parent to Another. And today's guest, Jeanette, is one of the 48 contributing authors in this book. And I'd like to take a moment to read you one of the reader reviews that has come in for this book. This reader says, quote, "Losing a partner and caring for children simultaneously is a Herculean task. I found the diversity of input interesting and relevant, from day-to-day struggles to more existential decisions. Jenny also provides a number of resources which are bound to be helpful for anyone in this type of crisis." So thank you, Laurel, on Amazon for your thoughtful review. You can pick up a copy of Widowed Parents Unite at bookshop.org, Barnes & Noble, Amazon, or wherever you like to buy your books. And we are coming up on Children's Grief Awareness Month, which is in November every year, so be on the lookout for some special episodes during the month of November. My theme for the month this year is supporting widowed parents in supporting their own grieving kids, and of course teens. So that's all the news from here. Let's get on with the show. Support for this podcast comes from BetterHelp. You can talk with a licensed professional therapist online, anytime, anywhere. Visit betterhelp.com/widowedparent to learn more and get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/widowedparent. I hope you'll check it out. My guest today is Jeanette Koncikowski. Jeanette is a writer, activist, community educator, and advocate. She is also a widowed parent. She's the author of the new memoir, Shipwrecked, a memoir of widowed parenting and life after loss. And she was my guest in episode 10 of the Widowed Parent Podcast way back in 2019. Jeanette is also a contributing author of my latest book, Widowed Parents Unite, 52 Tips to Get Through the First Year from One Widowed Parent to Another. She's joining us today from Buffalo, New York. Jeanette, welcome to the show.
Hi, Jenny. Thank you so much for having me back.
Yeah, it's great to see you again. I've really been looking forward to talking to you today. I think it's been like 5 years since we talked for that first interview, which is completely crazy because feels like it was maybe about a year ago.
I know 5 years went by really fast, and I was so happy to see all the resources for widowed parents that are here now, even just in the last 5 years. You know, when we first talked, you were fairly new. The podcast, it wasn't anything like what you're doing now. And now I see, there's multiple podcasts, new books coming out all the time, all kinds of new resources. It really makes me happy to see that the world is paying more attention to the experience of widowed parents.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. And you've been doing a bunch with this. The Widowed Parent Project, I think, is what you started initially when your husband died back in 2014. And I think the story is you went into a bookstore and struck out.
Yeah, I went into my local Barnes & Noble, kind of the first time I surfaced after he died, looking for a book because I tend to cope through intellectualizing everything. So I figured there must be a book that would help me figure out what I was supposed to do. And I couldn't find a book. There were books about children in grief, and there were memoirs from widows, and there were, meditations on grief, as if I needed to meditate anymore on what I was going to do with my life now. But I really couldn't find a book that spoke to how to parent children through grief and this particular loss of a parent. And so about 2 years after that, I decided to kind of apply my experience, both my lived experience as a widowed parent as I was going through my grief, but also my background as a trauma counselor and a researcher, and write the book I wish I had at that time.
Yes, terrific. And I know we talked a little bit about that 5 years ago. And it's very exciting that your book now, Shipwrecked, is out. As we speak now, it's almost out. And I think by the time this airs, it will be available. So congratulations. That's a huge, huge accomplishment.
Yeah, it's hard, as I know, this as a widowed parent, to find time for creative pursuits. And so I thought, when I set out to write it, it might take me 2 or 3 years. It took 7.5 and, and another year to get it self-published and get through that process. So longer than I thought it would take to get there. But I also think it was the time I needed to come to terms with my story and to get comfortable putting it out in the world. And so, at the end of the day, I think it was what it needed to be. And I'm glad it's coming out now. It's been 10 years since Mark, my first husband, died. And so it seems like this is the right time, and I'm in the right space to be able to kind of navigate my own feelings around, putting it all in a memoir.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, congratulations. And so I'm going to put a link in the show notes to episode 10, where we talked a lot about your story and your experience and kind of how you became widowed. But why don't we just start there? Some people probably haven't heard that episode yet. Can you tell us a little bit about sort of before Mark died? What was your sort of normal situation? What was life like before he died? And then how did you happen to become widowed?
Sure. So, like many American families, we were both working parents. He was in school and he was working. He was working on, or had just finished his doctorate of chiropractic about 1.5 years before he passed. And so we had just kind of come through that. And I was working 2 jobs. I was teaching part-time. I was also working full-time at another college in a staff position. And we just had a lot on our plate. We had little kids. I had a mom that was sick with breast cancer. And so we had, as many families do, that kind of sandwich generation where you're caring for a parent, you're caring for young children, you're both working. Things were, because of all that, pretty stressful in our lives and our marriage. And the year before he died, it really took a toll on us, and we had ended up separating. We were separated for 13 months, not divorced. And we were actually dating again and in couples counseling when he passed. And so, one of the things that was important for me to capture in this book and in the advocacy work I do to people that, not everyone had a kind of perfect marriage when they were widowed. And I think we have this, we tend to put people on pedestals after they die, as we should, on the one hand, to kind of honor the life they live. But I think that also does a little bit of disservice to those of us that are left behind, particularly if you have children. And so, things weren't the best. They definitely could have been better. And we didn't get a chance to see what our repair would have really looked like. We had been, as I said, going to counseling, and we had been dating, and things were moving in a really positive direction. And then he died suddenly from sudden unexplained death and epilepsy. He had been diagnosed with epilepsy 1.5 years before he died as well. So there was just so many stressors and so many things happening all at once. And it was really, a lot of the book is about kind of coming to terms with all of that in the aftermath of his death.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I think and thank you for telling us about that. And I think that's one of the valuable aspects of this book for readers, is it's a real portrait of a situation of a really complicated relationship and separation, and not everything's rosy situation in becoming widowed. And I think that so often, I don't know, who knows what the real numbers are, but a lot of the stories we hear end up being, things that people are willing to talk about are like, more positive, right? Like love story kind of situations.
Yeah, and I really wanted to honor our love story. And so you'll see that in the book, I
Yeah.
hope. And I also wanted to honor the struggles that we went through.
Yeah. And I think I misspoke a little, I think because the video was freezing up for a second there. What I meant was like a love story on a pedestal situation.
Right, right. Um, I have spoken at Camp Widow a few times
I
now in
wanted to ask you
Toronto.
about that. Yeah.
Yeah, and one of the things that I'm always nervous about, I get asked to come back and, kind of do the workshop on the people that are grieving the not perfect marriage. And I've had so many people come up to me and thank me for being willing to tell this story because it's not about, um, the couple that had everything and then your beloved dies and you have to carry on. That's part of it. I mean, that's every one of us, right? But there is also a lot of mental health issues in our background. There is certainly emotional abuse. There is chronic physical health issues and just a lot of other stressors. And, being able to kind of talk about things that I kept secret for a really long time in the context of my marriage and now being able to kind of be on the other side of that and talking about it publicly are two very different things. But it was really important to me through my own healing to be able to kind of own the good, the bad, and the ugly of our relationship and not to sugarcoat it anymore and to
Hmm.
be able to feel like in honoring Mark, it really was honoring all of the pieces that he was and all of the pieces that our relationship was and also what I contributed to the good, the bad, and the ugly.
Uh-huh. Well, and I think that's one of the things I appreciated the book is you didn't shy away from sharing those things with us, and helping us to see, a portrait inside your life and experience. And I think that, that's one of the nice things about memoir is that readers can learn from someone else's life and experience and, the parts that resonate with them as similar, the parts that are different, the parts that make them think or question or wonder. I think memoir kind of is an opportunity to share in a way that's helpful to readers.
I actually wasn't expecting this to be a memoir. When I
Ah,
first drafted it, it
okay.
was
Tell us
going to
about
just be
that.
kind of a research straight nonfiction book
Okay.
about, widow parenting. And I was going to include little snippets of the story. And I've interviewed about 3 dozen other widowed parents. And my original thought was I would take all of our stories and then, weave in more newer research on grief and families and things like that. And then the very early copies that my editor and some folks close to me, including in the widow community, read, they were like, this isn't enough. Like you're
Hmm.
not going deep enough,
Hmm.
and you have this story that we're getting pieces of, and we want to know more about your story. So my editor suggested I talk with a book strategist, and that person was phenomenal and really helped me think through like what were some of the fears holding me back about turning my story into a memoir
Ah.
and what would best serve my audience. And so I am going to actually have two books out. One is the memoir that's coming out first, that's Shipwrecked, and then my second book, Stronger Than the Storm, is going to be kind of a companion guidebook for widowed parents, and that's going to include the stories of the other widowed parents that I interviewed, as well as some of the tools and new research that I've been exposed to as I've been writing Shipwrecked. So I hope to have that kind of be a companion workbook to Shipwrecked, and really between the two provide widowed parents with some, kind of both the personal experience, but then some professional advice and research on how to navigate their family through grief.
Hmm. That sounds terrific. And I'm making a mental note here that maybe we should talk for my other podcast that I'm starting for authors. Because I think this isn't, just putting my author hat on for a minute here, right? Like I noticed that you referred to this as a teaching memoir, I think maybe in the
Right.
introduction or something, which is sort of a variation on the straight up memoir genre. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so you'll notice that most of the chapters, at least kind of towards the middle of the book, and with some lessons learned. And I tried to reflect as I was going through my own experience, and then as I was talking with these other widowed parents about, what are the key takeaways? What are the things I wish I had known? What are the strategies that we all use to cope and to get through the most difficult days, or to have the tough conversations with our kids? And so the lesson learned at the end of each chapter kind of meant to be advice for the newly widowed parent of, how to navigate whatever the topic is I'm exploring. So the book kind of it's my story, but it moves through themes that I think most widowed parents are going to find commonality with, including, if you happen to pick this up because you are preparing to be widowed in the case of, a terminal illness or something, learning how to talk to your children about the death, learning how to plan for the memorial and whether or not you should include your children in that. And the resounding answer is yes, you should include your children in that, so long as they're comfortable with that. Right. I kind of look at how you can see closure in your marriage, because even if you had a really strong marriage, when in the case of a sudden death, especially, right, like it just stops. And suddenly you're, not married anymore. You're now a widow. And like, what does that mean? And how do you come to terms psychologically with that? And so there's a chapter on kind of how to help you come to terms with the end of your marriage. Also some information on here, for then deciding to move forward from that and seeking a new partnership and dating and sex as a widowed person and all of those things. But I wanted to really give some practical guidance, because that was the thing that I was seeking more than anything, was like someone tell me what to do, someone give me options, because I felt so very isolated when I was first widowed.
Yeah, that's interesting. Gosh, I felt similarly. I was 2 years after you. It was 2016. But gosh, if we'd both been in Buffalo at the same time, I think we would have bonded over all the same questions and same.
Right. And, I had actually I was very lucky to find a local widowed support group, right? Within weeks of being widowed, there was a meetup group I attended, and I met some wonderful people there, including my now second husband. But most of the people were so much older than I was in the group that I had a really hard time relating to them. They got the widow part, right? But they didn't get parent part, and they didn't get parenting grieving children, and how much more stress and strain and anxiety that added to my own experience coping with my grief. And so that's kind of how I started Widow Parent Project in 2016, was because I wasn't finding the right community or all the community that I needed locally. And, because other widow parents didn't have time. If you didn't have a babysitter, you couldn't come to the support group.
Right.
So
right.
it was like, I'm going to go where the widow parents are, which at the time was Facebook. And we still have that group active today.
Oh, nice. And the rest is history. And now you have a book.
Right.
I want to go back to the teaching memoir, and at the end of most of the chapters, the lessons learned sections, which I think you have a lot of really useful tips and information and advice. And one of the chapters, the section at the end, is called Supporting Children's Evolving Grief Over Time, which I think is a really important what's the word I'm looking for? Concept for people to understand, right? Like there's the immediate, like the person just died. And then there's the fact that kids are growing and changing and developing cognitively over a bunch of years to come. And their grief will probably evolve and change and need to be explored over and over again.
I think that is something that we don't prepare widow parents for, or the world thinks is, your grief lasts a year, right? And we now have things like the DSM that'll tell us if you're still grieving after a year, somehow that's, not acceptable in society. And that's not the case at all. And the research that is out there on grief and family bereavement really shows that this is going to developmentally affect children, whatever age they are, right, when the loss occurred. It is going to continue to affect them for the rest of their life. So obviously, younger children like mine were 5 and 9 when I was widowed. For my children over the last 10 years, their grief has shown up in all kinds of ways and still does on a regular basis. It has not gone away. It adapted here, right? We just learn how to get better at acknowledging it, talking through it, feeling through it, moving through it. And it's definitely lessened in terms of the acuteness of the grief from when we first lost Mark, but it's still there. It's there when my daughter started her first day of college and dad wasn't there. It's there when she walked across the stage at graduation and he's not there. It's there when, she's going into her own relationships now as a teenager and reflecting back on what our relationship was like. And so, the grief is ever present. I think it's just helping kids learn the tools and strategies to cope with it over time. And I don't think that we've done a really good job within kind of the psychology, counseling, social work field at helping people understand that. We treat symptoms, we treat people when they have acute needs, and then we don't really prepare you for like the rest of life, right?
Yeah.
And so that was one of the things that I wanted to really attend to in this book and share through my children's experience with their permission. My kids were incredible through the writing of this book, and they approved all the content that got written about them, and I interviewed them for that chapter to kind of capture their experiences at their request. And, we really wanted to show like it is at least a sample, right, of what experience is included in here, ways that they coped and some of the struggles that they had.
Yeah. I just want to interject for a second to listeners and apologize. We're having a few technical difficulties on the line, and I hope that you're catching all of what Jeanette is saying. I think we've had a few glitches, which maybe we can deal with in post-production. And if we get a big glitch, we will restart. But I think we're in great shape, and we're hearing what you're sharing with us. So thank you for that. But I did want to mention, listeners, hang on. If I think we have some, who knows what's going on in the technical world, but it is what it is. I love what you said in that chapter, supporting children's grief, children's evolving grief over time. You said little kids will become big kids. Big kids can start to process their grief at deeper levels. And I think that's the point we were just talking about. And I think that's such an important point for parents to keep in mind. And like you said, something that's maybe not intuitively obvious, or at least it wasn't obvious to me,
Right.
when I first found myself in this situation.
Yeah, when they were first in deep grief, we dealt with the immediate issues for the kids. What does it mean to lose the role of their dad at a very practical level, right? Like who's getting you from school on Thursday?
Mm-hmm.
And dealing with the overwhelm of coming home, he doesn't live anymore, those kinds of things. And then as they got older, it was more of those secondary losses. So to be the only kid at school who doesn't have a father present for Dads and Donuts Day. What does it mean to, be the kid who doesn't want your teacher to know that, your dad is dead? I mean, my oldest got to 6th grade and was like, can you stop telling my teachers about dad? Like, can we just pretend it didn't happen and not talk about my father because it makes me feel different, and she got to a place where she could talk about it more easily by the time she was in high school. But that middle school age, right, of like, I don't want to be different. I want to fit in. Please don't go in and make me the odd kid the day that we start, and so kind of navigating some of those differences. And then because of Mark's mental health issues for my children, I really had to confront my own willingness as a parent to like how honest I wanted to be with them, right? About what he went through, what I went through in my marriage, and how he died. And one of the clinicians that I interview, I can't remember. I think he doesn't make it into the next book, but I had a chance to meet with Dr. Justin Yap from the
he's terrific. Yeah.
Widow Parent Program, right?
Yeah.
And Justin talked to me about telling kids the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. And it's that you tell them the truth and you tell them nothing but the truth, but that whole truth, that is kind of what you have to determine, when are they developmentally ready for the whole truth? And I had a beautiful experience with my 19-year-old. She came home from college. The book had just arrived and I left her a copy in her room. She immediately like unpacked her bags and was like, oh my gosh, the book is here. And she shut the door and she went in and she started reading the book.
Oh.
And she would come out every time something was kind of new to her. And, she'd cry and I'd hold her and we'd talk through it. And I was like, are you okay with this? And she said to me at one point, like, I never saw you as a woman. you've always been my mom. And so when I read this now, I see you as a woman and I see you as a wife and I see your loss. And it was a very adult thing to say to me, right? Of
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
her being able to kind of distance herself a little bit and see this as a story, even though
Yeah.
it's our story.
Uh-huh.
And that was something that, she wasn't capable of just a couple of years ago. And
Mm-hmm.
so how my children's grief has changed over time, how I've had to change my parenting to respond to that. It's definitely a lot less intensive than it used to be, which I'm grateful for. We're 10 years out, so it looks pretty different than it did in the past, but um, it definitely is something that I was not prepared for. I thought it was going to be the kind of thing of like, we do some counseling and they'll be good. And we've been in and out of, all three of us have been in and out of counseling for 10 years. And I've come to really see it as like a resource that is there. And I'll say to my kids, it's always here. Like if you need to go back, I will figure out how to make that happen. And to not see it as something that is shameful or we don't see as an everyday tool in our lives that we can use to help us cope. And so the therapy that they've received has really been there for them and has had to adjust as well.
Yeah. Well, thank you for sharing all that. And it is interesting to hear and encouraging. I think maybe that our kids do grow up, and your oldest now at 19, being able and willing to read your story and see it from a different point of view than her child's point of view of living through it, is terrific. And I think you've given us a real gift at the end of the book, of interviewing your kids, both of them separately. Um, I think Grace pointed out that you've all had the same general experience of Mark's death, but your paths are each your own, which I thought was a very
Yes.
interesting insight.
Right. And that, one of the things that, uh, again, I've had to kind of grapple with, and I think this is a main takeaway from me of this book and of my experience, right, is that you can't fix things for your kids. And that's what we want to do, right? As parents, it's our job to fix it.
Mm.
You can't fix the fact that their other parent died.
Mm-hmm.
All you can really do is bear witness to their pain and give them the tools and the skills and the shoulders that they need to get through that experience. But you can't undo it, right? There is no unmaking this person dead, and there is no taking away their grief. And so learning how to kind of bear witness to them and that their griefs were so different, their experiences, even though the same kind of traumatic events they went through the morning that
I think we're
found him.
frozen again.
I'm sorry, I don't know.
That's okay. I lost sight of where we just were in the tech glitch here. So let's just continue. What you were talking about did remind me, in one of those lessons learned chapters, you said if you're worried about your kids, whether in the beginning or 5 years down the road from the initial loss, get a professional mental health assessment, and if needed, get your kids into therapy. And I think that's a really important point, and maybe one that's not like, well, I guess how does one begin to get a professional mental health assessment, or how does one know if such a thing is a good idea or is needed?
Right. I worked as a family therapist very early in my own career. And too often, I think parents wait until something's at a crisis level, right?
Mm.
Kids been kicked out of school, they're truant, they're fighting, they're self-harming, they're self-destructive. Waiting until there's that kind of warning sign can get an assessment at a local emergency room if you think you have a child that's at a crisis point, right, where they could harm themselves or harm someone else. But you don't have to wait till it gets that severe. I think if you have kids that have any amount of adverse impact on their daily functioning, they're having trouble sleeping, they're losing weight or gaining a lot of weight, they are struggling with making friends, they are incredibly anxious, which we know is normal for kids after grief, fear of separation from the surviving parent, right? Those can all be signs that it's useful to talk to a counselor, and particularly a grief counselor, finding someone that has experience with children at grief. And you can usually find someone through, like if you have a local 211 or information line, if you have a local bereavement center, those at least kind of folks will point you in the right direction.
And I'll put a link in the show notes to the National Alliance for Children's Grief which has you can put in your zip code or your city and find grief programs near you, which is a great way to find some programs in your local community. And also the Dougie Center has a similar lookup tool as well.
Yes. And, I always tell people it's so hard, right? Because with managed care, like it's so hard to just find a therapist, get into therapy, be able to afford therapy, and then you get there and maybe the person doesn't feel good, right? It's not a good fit. Or you feel comfortable with them, but your child does not. And so then you have to start all over looking for someone else. But I think if you put in the work and you find the right therapist for your kiddo and for your family, you will see transformation, because it's really less about the type of therapy, right? Or the method of therapy. And it's more about finding a safe, trusting relationship with someone to process those emotions and to be kind of an emotional container. And so I really tell parents, like, do the work to find the right fit for your family with a therapist. And I know that is a very privileged thing to say, because a lot of people can't afford therapy, or you get the therapist that's assigned to you. But using your voice as an advocate to keep asking for the right person if you need to.
Okay, I'm glad you mentioned that, because that can feel tricky, or I don't know if confusing is the word I'm looking for, but more like I don't know how to proceed here, right? And I mean,
Right.
how do you know if someone is the right? Like, you go on someone's website or someone's profile on a listing or whatever, and maybe it's hard to tell who's going to be good, or who your kid's going to relate to, or who's going to be a good fit.
Right. And a lot of the therapists now, since COVID, if they are doing online therapy, or they're booking online, they'll offer you like a 15-minute free consultation. That's a
Ah,
great opportunity to just jump on, say, hi, tell me about yourself. Here's our family situation. And you can get even in 15 minutes, you get some sense of whether or not you like this person, right? Are they warm? Do they have any experience with kids in grief? If you
hmm.
have a traumatic component, is that something that they are trained in? So just getting some basic information can be helpful. And usually those are free of charge, short consultations.
Mm, that's
And
a great idea. Yeah, and
I,
even
I
that sort of,
always tell parents, give that a try.
yeah, and that gut level, like, is this someone that I want to talk to, or that I could see
Right. And then
myself talking
also,
to?
try your pediatrician. Pediatricians often know and will refer families to counselors too. So if you are, all else fails, kind of maybe checking in with your pediatrician and asking if they have a recommendation for someone that specifically works with children and families in grief. Because I do think you want someone that has been trained in grief counseling. Um, you don't want someone like me when I was 23, right? And I was new in therapy and not trained in grief counseling, to be your grief counselor. You want someone that has had, even if they haven't had that lived experience, that they have had that professional training.
Hmm. And it is important to understand that not all counselors have had any training in grief.
Right, right. And some of them, I lecture at the local college sometimes on grief as part of my advocacy work, and even at the MSW level, they might have one course on grief
Mm,
and loss, right? So that something is better than nothing, but it is not usually something people have deep training in unless they seek it out, and so that's another indicator, right? If it's a good match, does that person have they had training, and ask about what that training has looked like and what kind of families they've worked with. Um, and what is their experience with kids. My kids went through, my one kiddo, Milo, had two different counselors over the last 10 years. We were lucky with Grace. She was able to see the same person start and stop, over time. But I was also very privileged in that I was able to do private pay. So we went around managed care, and I, decided for me it was a priority for my single family income that it was going to be spent. Any excess money was not going to be spent on sports and activities, but on therapy. And, my kids didn't maybe have all the same experiences that the other kids did. And not all kids need therapy, right? Mine had a traumatic component to their dad's death. We had the separation. We had a lot of extra stuff.
mm,
And so therapy for my kids was my priority for the first 2 years after he died. So they got one other activity, right? One did gymnastics and one was doing ice skating, but it was like, this is what we do, right? We are doing our work. We are working on getting through this. And that meant that one night or two nights a week, one or the other of us was in counseling,
mm,
until we got to a place where we felt like we could do better on our own.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah. I think that's helpful. Thank you. And wanted to also touch on I mentioned that you had interviewed both of your kids at the end, and I shared one of Grace's observations, and I wanted to read a piece you had asked your youngest. What advice do you have to give parents of grieving kids? Milo thought about it for a moment and looked me straight in the eye and said, quote, "You just need to give us time to get a handle on everything." And I thought that was really profound. And I really do think it's a gift that we have a chance to hear straight from a couple of grieving teens, grieving kids, kind of what their experience has been like.
Yeah, and if you read the book, you'll see they had very different experiences, right? And that the one that I thought was going to have post-traumatic stress disorder was not the one that ended up with the diagnosis of it. And for Milo, they were 5 when their dad died. They were 4 when we separated. They also had a lot of other stuff they were dealing with as they aged, including questions about their gender identity and their sexual orientation. And, one of the things that as a parent, I was always looking at is like, is this developmentally normal, whatever this is that they're going through, right? Whether it's um, feelings, thoughts, beliefs, experiences, or is this the grief? And sometimes it's really hard, even for clinicians, to like parse that out, right? It's kind of all entangled in one big ball of kid stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And it was really helpful for me to have this time to reflect with my kids. And it was really hard. That writing that chapter was brutal. Those were the hardest pieces of the writing I did. And I took myself away from my kids to do that writing. I interviewed them, I taped it, and then I sat in a retreat center and sobbed for like 3 days while I was working on that chapter, because it was, it's hard to go back to hear what their experience was and how different it was from my experience of that day.
Mm-hmm.
And to know the ways in which I couldn't be there in the worst moment of their life because I was attending to their father's death.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so there was that piece of it. And so, Milo kind of jokes that they're an old soul. They had to grow up really fast.
Mm-hmm.
And the way Mark's death impacted them, it's really shaped their personality. I think Grace was a little bit older, right? She was 9. And so she kind of had this little sense of like, this is who I am as a person. And for Milo, that was still really developing.
Mm-hmm.
And so when he died, it just, the world stopped.
Mm-hmm.
It stopped for all of us, but it stopped in a developmentally specific way for Milo. And it took Milo a little bit longer to kind of catch up to kind of some more normalcy in their life after that. They really had to do, in some ways, some deeper level work, right, around just getting through the day-to-day functioning. But I'm really proud of both of my kids with how far they've come and how compassionate and kind they are to other people that they see going through difficult circumstances because they've experienced difficulty in their life and they've gotten through adversity. And I'm very pleased to say that all of that therapy paid off. They are very well-adjusted teenagers. And, it continues to kind of be a pleasure to be their mom. But I think we have a different relationship than, and I don't know how you experience this with your kids, but I find that with widowed families, I think you have a more intense bond with your kids because you've gone through this thing together, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's different than maybe what I see in other families.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I think some of that comes out in your book and your story, and we won't have time to dive into this part here, but where you got snowed in your big old house shortly after Mark died, and you made the decision to move to a new town nearby in a small house and sort of restart as a family of 3 in a new place. And I think we can see a lot of that bonding and how you've navigated some of that throughout the story. And I also think that, you've shared 10 years worth of reflections and paths here, right? Like it's not just this isn't just a reflection on year 1, or it's not just what am I trying to say? Through 10 years, there's a lot of weaves and turns and ups and downs. And I think it's really a gift to us to get to see all that. So thank you.
Thank you so much for that. And thank you for taking the time to read it and share with your listeners about it. It was a long kind of it was trying to, as an author, trying to figure out like, well, how much of the story do I tell, right? And do I stop at a certain point, and then kind of getting to the place of like, I didn't do my own deep therapy, trauma therapy until I was in year 6 and 7. I needed, I took care of my kids first, and that meant I pushed down a lot of my own stuff. And COVID came along and blew it all back up. Right? So,
COVID blew a lot of things up, I think.
Yeah,
Yes.
all the healing I thought I had done actually turned out not to be quite as much healing as I needed to do. And the story wasn't done because I still had a lot of work to do, and I still have work. I mean, it's something that's going to stay with me my whole life. But, to be able to kind of reflect back and see what I couldn't have seen 10 years ago, right? Which was that I was going to get to another life on the other side of this loss that I never in a million years would have believed possible if you would have told me, 2 months after he died, that this is where I could be today.
Yeah.
I just didn't have any hope. I didn't see a way forward. I was so lost in the ocean. And kind of now going through that journey, like, and being like, I got to shore, and then I had to return to the shipwreck, right? And that's the other part of this book that I struggled with trying to figure out, like, with the ending, right? Is it was like really recognizing I had to return to the site of the wreckage and dive down. And I'm not going to spoil how the book ends, but it was doing that work that helped me recognize that, you can't run away. You can't run away from what happened. And it's a whole nother level to say you accept something and then to actually do the work of acceptance and moving forward, because there is no letting go, right? It's just how you put it back together in the aftermath, and how you cope and how you move forward together that matters.
Yeah. Beautiful. And you get into a lot of this, your own growth and journey in the book, which I'll refer readers to the book to read about that. But it's reminding me, I mentioned up top that you were one of the contributing authors in my latest book, Widowed Parents Unite. And there was a little piece of that I noticed that very much related to the ideas you're sharing in your book here. In Widowed Parents Unite, one of the things you said was, if I've taken anything away from my loss, it's that my life is important too, and I get to define what my life after loss looks like.
Yeah, I don't think I realized how I would transform through the loss of Mark. In the beginning, it was very much like we both died. It felt like that, right? Like it feels like that in the beginning, like he died and the person I was, Jen and Mark, Jen died with Mark. Like that identity I had is gone. Or so I thought, right? And the work on the other side of that was figuring out, who am I now without him, especially because I was so young when I started dating him. I was 15 and I was a teenager, and I look back and think, God, I was so young, right? So this work for me has been about my own identity as much as the loss, and learning to accept the good, the bad, and the ugly in myself, and that there is a gift. There has been gifts for me, and I know that's not for everyone. I don't like to be that cliche. That's like, there's gifts in your grief, but for me there were, and one of them was that I found my voice, and I wrote a story about it. So
yeah, terrific. Well, I think that's actually a great place for us to end today. So my guest today is Jeanette Koncikowski, author of the new memoir, Shipwrecked, a memoir of widowed parenting and life after loss. So Jeanette, where can listeners find you and find your book?
You can find me at widowedparentproject.com, which is my new website that is just launched. Still a little bit of a work in progress. We're going to be adding stories of widowed parents in the coming months. And then you can also get the book at Amazon, Barnes & Nobles. It's pre-sale now. It comes out June 18th. Join us for the virtual launch, which you can learn more about at widowedparentproject.com too. And if you really want to read it now, you can buy it on Book Baby's Bookshop, and it's available for sale now. And I thank you so much, Jenny, for having me back and for sharing about the book. I really appreciate all you do for widowed parents.
No, thank you. And thank you so much, Jeanette, for speaking with me today. I hope you enjoyed my interview with Jeanette Koncikowski as much as I did. You can find show notes and all the links at widowedparentpodcast.com. Look for episode 155. And if you're finding the Widowed Parent Podcast helpful, please consider supporting the show. It's easy. Just go to buymeacoffee.com/widowedparent. That's buymeacoffee.com/widowedparent. As always, thank you for listening. And until next week, remember, you've got this.
Thank you for listening to the Widowed Parent Podcast with your host, Jenny Lisk. Connect with us on social media and at widowedparentpodcast.com.